I'm going to be saying George Washington 1,000 times within this video. Let's begin. George Washington, 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 George Washington. What? Do another one. George Washington, 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 George Washington. Fuck. George Washington. George Washington. That's the first 20. Let me drink some water. 1,980 left to go. Oh, okay. George Washington, 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 George Washington. That's 40. All right, so we're averaging 40 George Washingtons per 1 minute and a half. Minus of like 10 seconds. Then we're all right. We're probably gonna be done with this in like 5 minutes. I don't know. Fuck no. All right. Can we continue? George Washington, 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 George Washington. Fuck. All right. Wait. Let me minus one. George Washington, George Washington, George Washington, George Washington. That was like 2 and I didn't click them. George Washington, 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 George Washington. That was like 2 that I fucked up right there. George Washington, George Washington. All right, that's another one. George Washington, 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 George Washington. More water, bro. Like my mouth is getting dry. Dude, it's like 2:30 in the morning. I had an idea for this video, and I didn't want it to like leave my head, so I'm doing it right now. Also, if you're watching right now, comment below who I should say next. Thank you. George Washington, 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 George Washington. First 100. Oh fuck. Oh fuck. Oh shit. George Washington, 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 Washington, George 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 Washington. That is such a weird name. All right, sorry. George Washington, 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 Washington, George 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 Washington. That's 200, by the way. And we just said one more too, so it's 201. I gotta start breathing in the middle of the words. Fuck. This is gonna suck, and I hope I don't run out of phone storage because I'm gonna cut out in case. So, trust me. I'll show you right now. 201. 201. If I cut out, I will revert back to like 220-ish. Okay? Thank you. Yeah, we're lifting my feet up. Start it back up. George Washington. George Washington. Fuck, like I keep clicking. Like I keep accidentally clicking. It's 203 right now. Like you can see it in my eyes. Maybe not, actually. George Washington. 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 Let me favorite this, actually. George Washington. 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 Washington. George 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 Washington. Washington. George 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 Washington. Washington. George Washington. George Washington. That's 300. That is 300. We are almost a full third way of the way. Okay. How am I feeling? All right. I'm starting to get weird with how I'm speaking. I'm starting to mess up George Washington's name. And I honestly should not have done this tonight. But nevertheless, my Twitch stream did not get watched. I do want to get some views on YouTube, and my first video did not get views either. So I got to do something here. I have to. It's starting to get hot too, so I think I'm gonna open my window real quick. Oh man. I'm sorry. Alright. George Washington, 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 George Washington. I keep fucking up the words, but I don't care anymore because it's going to go quicker. Let me just. Yeah, I did it. I raised my chair. 314. Oh yeah, no, we're not showing my feet. George Washington, 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 George Washington. If my door starts slamming, it's because it's not fully connected to my. Where am I pointing? My door right there. The wood. Yeah. It's not fully connected to the wall, so if it starts slamming, deal with it. Oh. George Washington, 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 George Washington. 350. Damn, that's so annoying. Why is it taking? It's taking so long. George Washington, George Washington, George Washington, George Washington, George Washington. 355. I'm gonna stretch real quick. I'll be right back. Oh man, I'm back. New meta. New meta. Luigi's Cherry Italian Ice. It just made my throat feel way better. All right. Fellas, are we ready? 355. We're getting to 1,000 right fucking now. George Washington, 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 George Washington. Like, what the fuck kind of fucking name is that? Who names their son George? Actually, take that back. Who the fuck is Washington? What does that come from? What kind of British person names themselves that? Whatever. George Washington, 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 400. Bro, this is actually like a lung tester, man. I just swallowed like half of that whole. How do I feel right now? Tired, annoyed that I even thought of doing this. Will this get views? Probably not. Am I like Mr. Beast? No. Let's check my cookie clicker. Let's check my cookie clicker. It's going pretty alright. Is this shit inverted? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I kind of cheated. That's why I have this many. But, whatever. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. 240. Started this at like 223. So, making progress. George Washington, 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 George Washington. I feel like this is needed. Don't mind the hole in the wall. That's why I have the flag up right there. How do I... 1 second. I'm pissed off. I lost storage and they deleted like 4 minutes of me clicking and I got to 500. I'm not going back. I'm not going back. What I will do is explain to you on why this is hard and why you should fuck off if you think this is easy. 1, fuck you. You're a bitch. Your pee-pee's small. If your pee-pee is not existent, it's still small, okay? You got no balls. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know, man. This is hurting my head. Whatever. 246. Right on the nose. Let's do this. We're getting to 1,000 in the next 10 minutes. That was weird, I'm sorry. And I'm starting to sweat and my head hurts and everything hurts and I'm not taking my hat off. Okay, let's go. George Washington, 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 George Washington. George Washington, 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 George Washington. I know y'all heard that. I know y'all heard that big ass crack that just came out of my neck. Oh, that shit is so good. I'm not gonna lie to you. That was so good. George Washington, 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 George Washington. George Washington, 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 George Washington. 600. Bitches, fuck you. Okay, I know y'all missed like about 100.5 of me speaking, right? But it's okay. We all make mistakes. How am I gonna make people watch this on TikTok? You won't. If you're from here, if you're on here from TikTok and you watch this point, I love you. I will tickle your toes at night, tonight, or tomorrow night, or whenever you're Washington, whenever Washington is. Fuck! I said watching, whenever you're watching this, not Washingtoning this. This is really bad, man. Tomorrow's Sunday. It's like the first Sunday ever that I could actually relax. My brother just left for the army. He's going to become the new George Washington. Oh, yeah. I snuck that in. Maybe if I start sentences with George Washington. Who's the first president of the United States? George Washington. Who's my grandfather? George Washington, 604. I'm sorry. Oh, man. All right. I think we're going to grind to 700. Take a relax 2 minutes. Back to it, right? George Washington, 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 George Washington. It would have been way better to lip sync this. Be like, yeah, that'd be way better. I don't know, man. George Washington, 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 George. George Washington, 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 George Washington. I'm sorry. George Washington, 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 George Washington. George Washington, 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 George Washington. Like Emperor Palpatine. Holy shit. George Washington, 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 George Washington. George Washington, George Washington, George Washington, George Washington. I'm putting this back up because this is actually like hot. I don't know why. I think I put that back up, right? Oof. How we doing now? 700. We're locked in. The left of my jaw hurts. Why? I don't know. Okay, I'm gonna get real here. We're getting to 1,000. George Washington, 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 George Washington. Did I click that? Yes, I fucking did. Because in my head, I said George Washington. And then outside, you might not hear George Washington, but I did it. Fuck you. I love you too. It's alright. I'm sorry. George Washington, 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 George Washington. That's 2. That's 3. I took an extra because I'm better than the rest of you. George Washington, 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 Washington. George Washington, 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 George Washington. That's 800. I'm going to go take a piss. We're back. I swear to you, if I see George Washington again, I might kill George Washington. If I see George Washington's American flag, George Washington is going to George Washington his George Washington. George Washington, Washington. Washington, 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 George. George, Washington, 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 Washington. George Washington, 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 George Washington. Look at my eyes. They're starting to get bloodshot. I don't like that. George Washington, 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 George Washington. That's really bad. That tastes terrible. George Washington, George Washington, George Washington, George Washington, George Washington, George Washington. George Washington, 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 George really. George Washington, 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 Washington. I'm gonna say in my head 20 times. No, I'm kidding. George Washington, 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 George Washington. It's invincible now. Fuck that. George Washington, 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 George. Oh, we're over 900 now. 905. George Washington, 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 George Washington. George Washington, 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 Washington. George Washington, 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 George Washington. 50 more to go. I'm going to say a speech at 99. George Washington, 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 George Washington. We're at 99. Before I finish this, I would like to say thank you to a few YouTubers that have gotten me to start this. They don't even know that they got me to start this. They don't know that they pushed me to this, and then made me want to do this. But to the next few YouTubers, thank you. You're my favorite. You guys very much inspire me, and you guys are people I very much admire. Bill and Levine, Loaf. A lot of people say Loafy. I don't understand about that. Whatever. Mr. Beast. Joe Bartolozzi, Queso, Jinxie. Those two are just like I like those guys. Jay Schlatt, he's funny. Canel Joseph, Gideon, or I don't know. Is it Jadion? I don't know. Before he left, but he left for a good reason, so I respect him a lot for it. And yeah. I want to thank the United States government. I want to thank America. I want to thank the mother of the man that made this happen. I want to thank the Continental Congress. I want to thank my history teacher. I'm not going to say his name. I want to thank my other history teachers throughout the past, 4 years. And I would like to thank my family, my brother, Nick, my mom, my dad, my grandfather, my family. Yeah, okay. George Washington. All right, fuck it. Let's go get fucked up. Hey.